West Texas. I was teaching in a two-teacher elementary school. I'd never seen a two-teacher elementary school. In fact, I couldn't call it a two-room school because we didn't have two rooms. We had two Sabbath school rooms with a hall down the middle and two toilets connected to a church. And I loved that little school. But the rains came. And I wondered what I should do with the children so they wouldn't tear the place up. I finally decided that I would buy table games. I can't remember all the games, but I do remember one. Checkers. And I had one man in that class who had three boys in my school, in my room. And the middle one, and the man was what we call a straight testimony man. You know what I mean? And his middle son could be very rigorous. One day, Stephen came to me, the middle boy, and he said to me, "Mr. Knight, do you know what my daddy says, that Mrs. White says about checkers?" And I said, "Stephen, I'm pretty sure that I know what your daddy says, that Mrs. White says about checkers. Don't play them." He looked at me like, "Yeah, I got you now." I said, "Stephen, have you ever read those statements?" He said, "No." I said, "I'll read them with you. But first, I have a question. I want you to go home and ask your daddy if it's all right to play Monopoly." Now, do you understand the principle of Monopoly? It's a very nice game. It takes tons of time, but the thing is to bankrupt thy neighbor. It's a really neat game. Take away all of his hotels, take away all of his houses, take away all of his property, and when you bankrupted him, you are the winner. Nice game. And it usually takes hours and hours to get somebody that destitute. And I have often thought that, you could draw a little hole in the center of the board and just call it suicide. When you finish the game, playing on 1929. Or if you want to play it on Sabbath, just call the little hole hell. Anyway, it is not it's not based on Christian principles. Whatever's wrong with checkers, Monopoly's 50 times worse. I forgot all about the question. A couple of days later, Stephen comes back and he says, "Mr. Knight, my daddy says it's all right to play checkers." Because why? Because Mrs. White didn't say anything about it. You see, an Adventist without a quotation is pretty hopeless. We've got a quotation, we're like Pavlov's dog. You know Pavlov's dog, when the bell rings, the food was put there, and then when the bell rang, he salivated. Yeah, many of us are kind of reflexive. We got a quotation, we know exactly what to do. We don't have a quotation, we are dead in the water. Brain dead. No concept that there might be principles out there, that maybe decisions should be made on principle. Anyway, I read these things to Stephen. I said, "Stephen," after we got this far, I said, "Stephen, would you rather be outside and play, or would you rather play checkers?" Now, you got to understand Stephen. He was all boy. He said, "Mr. Knight, you know." Yeah, he didn't. I said, "Would you gamble with these things?" He looked quite indignant. said, of course not. Which meant not in front of me. I said, Stephen, I think you've got some very serious problems in your life, but I don't think one of them is checkers. Now, it wasn't until years later when I found out how those statements came to be. Why did Mrs. White ever write about checkers? Long history. James, her husband, had had several strokes, and he went to a health reform institute in New York, Dansville, our home on the hillside. And Dr. Jackson was there. And James went for his interview with Dr. Jackson, and he took one look at James, and he says, you're too serious. You need to stop thinking about religion. That's part. You are just too serious. Loosen up, man. What you need to do is dance and play checkers. Now, James really liked the therapy. Ellen was not quite so sure that that's what he needed, because she believed that trust in God and physical mental activity was what he needed. So she pulled him out of Dansville. Took him up to Greenville, Michigan, where they had a little farm. I don't know how they got a crop in the ground, but it came time to harvest the crop, and here's James he's still following the Jackson idea. Don't do anything useful. He says, Ellen, we got to get this crop in. How are we going to do it? I'm going to go get the neighbors. They'll help us. Ellen put on her sneakers, ran out the back door, went to every neighbor. Said, when my husband comes, say no. James. When James got back that evening, he says, I can't understand it. Not one neighbor will help us. Ellen says, I guess we'll have to do it. She says, Willie will throw up the hay, you drive, and I'll stack on the back of the wagon. That was just one of many maneuvers. She got James active, physically, mentally, spiritually. That was the beginning of his healing. Meanwhile, back in Battle Creek, the Adventists were going to start their own health reform institute, the Western Health Reform Institute. And there was only one Adventist physician in the whole world at that time, Dr. Horatio S. Lay. But he had worked in Dansville, New York. Now, Brother Lay was smart enough not to bring dancing with him. But he did bring checkers. Now, I don't know if Ellen White ever saw anything good in checkers, but I will say this. She did not feel that they were the best thing for recovering your health in that situation. She thought that minds ought to be engaged with active, positive things. Checkers may be good for some things, but they weren't good for that. That's where the checker statement came from. But back in those days, the Review and Herald was a live periodical. I mean, it was exciting. And so some wiseacre wrote in. I wish the Review and Herald was still a live periodical. Some wiseacre wrote in and said, who in the world is Ellen White to say we shouldn't play checkers when everybody knows she carries a game around in her suitcase when she travels? That brought forth a second statement on checkers and a denial of that particular avocation. Behind every statement, there's a situation. It's January.